When you think about it, Castlevania 3 is like the original Back to Basics threequel. It's like Devil May Cry 3 of the NES era. You had an all-time classic game that started the series on a high note and a significant departure from what people liked about it in the second installment, and then a third game that goes back to the formula of the original, only now on steroids, while also being a prequel to the first one. And I think this might set the record for how quickly I've referenced one of my favorite PS2 games in a video. Literally the second sentence was about Devil May Cry. But yeah, Castlevania 2 was a departure from the original, one that was praised back when it was originally released, but the design team still felt like returning to the formula of the original Castlevania was an appropriate way to round the series off on the NES. The game debuted in the Famicom in Japan in 1989 and came to the US on the NES 1 year later in 1990. I don't really have much to say about this one in the preamble because my memory of it is just that I know it's good but also really difficult in the US and it had new playable characters and was a prequel. So basically I knew the facts of this game but nothing to clue me into how I might feel about it. So I went into it with the same mindset as I did the previous two games. I decided to read up on it before playing. I'm glad I highlighted the cheesiness of the previous game's boxes because this game might have it the most of them all. The back of the box reads, "Only you can stop Dracula from drawing first blood." Led by the immortal Count Dracula, the greatest army of evil ever assembled is poised to bury mankind in a tomb of terror. Destroying this legion of swamp dragons, slasher skeletons, and forces of the undead will be the supreme challenge for the mightiest of warriors. Your place in history is 100 years before Simon Belmont's birth. Dracula is young at heart, but it'll take more than a stake to penetrate his evil. Luckily, you command the role of Trevor, Simon's forefather and the origin of the Belmont's warlord chromosomes. Like, okay game, we gotta use our warlord chromosomes to stop Dracula from plunging us into a tomb of terror, whatever any of that's supposed to mean. But the manual is equally enamored with this kind of talk, like how it says, "It's a cursed world we live in, thanks to Drac." Yeah, Drac, what an asshole he is. Releasing monsters from Morbid Mountain, and more mentions of the Tomb of Terror, and again with the Belmont warlord chromosomes, which I must specify is written as a proper noun in the manual, like it's just a thing that exists in the universe. I'm just picturing a doctor assessing a baby for Belmont warlord genes or something. But yeah, I love the corny energy of games from the 80s and 90s, though according to my comments, you 80s kids didn't even read the manual, which got a chuckle out of me as I was trying to imagine myself as one and failing from moment one. I personally tended to look through the manuals of the games I had as a kid, not to read them, but to see the pictures. Or in the case of gaming's greatest trilogy, just seeing how cool it was with the dialogue mid-instruction book. But let's be real, I'm only bringing this up so I can say I made the sly reference of the day. Let's just get into the game. Where we first enter the words "help me" as the name of our playthrough.
Don't worry, I'll explain later.
For now, we can keep it simple and just talk about the gameplay. As established by the box and manual, Castlevania 3 takes place over 100 years before the first game. If you recall, Dracula returns every century and it's up to the latest Belmont to vanquish him. In 1476, that was the job of Trevor Belmont, who must travel to Castlevania on foot and then venture to the top of the tower to face the Count and destroy him once and for all. Along the way, Trevor will meet allies who you can recruit to your mission, Grant, Sypha, and Alucard. But I can get back to them later since you begin the game just playing as Trevor. His gameplay is identical to Simon. He can't control his trajectory of jumps in midair. You use the Vampire Killer Whip to attack, which can be upgraded twice with a Morning Star to increase its damage and range. You find pork chops in the walls to restore your health. Hearts serve as ammo for sub-weapons, and the roster of sub-weapons for Trevor are all returning ones from the first game, like the dagger, the axe, the stopwatch, and the boss-killing holy water. My strategy in Castlevania 3 is exactly what I deduced towards the end of the first game. Use the items as they come up, but otherwise, if you find holy water, you're going to want to hold on to it like your life depends on it, because against bosses and enemies on the edges of platforms, it often does. The game is structured like Castlevania 1. You play through linear levels going up and down and left and right while dodging and attacking enemies and making use of sub-weapons to reach the end of the stage. At the end of a series of stages is a boss fight. The bosses are permanent checkpoints. If you get a game over in a stage on the way to a boss, you go back to the stage after the last boss fight. What's different in Dracula's Curse is how many more stages there are in this game compared to the previous ones and how much more variety is in it. If you look back at Castlevania 1, the levels themselves never really changed much or introduced new mechanics on the regular. The challenge was just how many new ways they could arrange the enemies and obstacles. In Castlevania 3, you play a variety of different areas both indoors and outdoors. Some of them looking quite appealing, and others were a bit of a color bleed in my eyes, but I appreciate the visual variety. But again, the levels introduced stuff all the time that shook up the gameplay. Like, you'll have to get around these platforms that spin when you jump on them, and you'll need to jump between these swinging pendulums, and stand on rotating gears, and jump on slippery seesaws, and run across waterways that propel you in different directions, and stand on top of spike-dropping platforms, and jump through mud that pulls you down, and the list goes on. Castlevania 3 is full of ideas that kept the game fresh and interesting, and I really respected that about Dracula's Curse. The game definitely expects that you've played the previous games, and so they felt it was really justified to go balls to the wall with the level ideas. One major innovation in Castlevania 3 is the branching paths system. This game encourages replay value in many ways. It has a ton more stages than the first game, but you won't see them all in a single playthrough. At certain moments in the early game, Trevor will have to go up or down, and that will decide what stage he goes to next. Early on, you have to choose between the woods and a clock tower. Later on, you'll choose again between the cemetery and a cave. Which one of these you pick determines how you get into Dracula's castle, either through the water or a cavern. Picking and choosing what setup works for you is a reason to keep coming back to Dracula's Curse repeatedly. And again, since the levels are so diverse, there's a reason to do it. You actually feel like you missed something. And another thing that's really integral to the replay value are the partner characters, Grant, Sypha, and Alucard. You can only team up with one character at a time, and you switch to them mid-stage by pressing the select button. What's pretty novel is how clearly switching characters in real time was so new to a video game that the box and manual felt the need to justify it in-universe. Like, when I see this, I just use my imagination and assume that the other character is with Trevor and pressing the button is them taking the lead, since I've played enough video games to know that's how that works. But since the visual is them literally switching places, and that wasn't a thing in a lot of games when this happened, the manual claims that these are all support spirits you team up with, and by pressing the button, Trevor literally transforms into them. That doesn't make any sense given how the story works. Trevor meets people and teams up with them. It's that simple. But I just thought it was funny that the game felt the need to explain this transformation sequence. Anyway, the characters are a central part of the path splitting system. The clock tower might not seem like a great choice. You climb all the way up and then all the way back down just to go back to the woods you would have played earlier. But traveling up is how you meet Grant. His special ability is that he can jump super high and cling to walls. At first, I didn't get that you cling to a wall by holding down the direction you're clinging in, so that led to some deaths, but he's good fun to use because of his high jump and ability to recover from falls. In the US version, his attack is a dagger he stabs with, and he can make use of the special weapons like Trevor can. Next, you can meet Sypha. She's a vampire slayer who uses magic-based attacks. And what's funny about her is that the US manual and the US localization refers to her as a guy. I guess because back then you still couldn't outright say a woman was playable in a video game. That's just unthinkable. This one magazine even going so far as to portray Sypha as some kind of ghoul. But the intention behind the character is that she's a human woman. But I didn't really like using her. You unlock different spells as item drops, but I thought the range of her default attack was worse than just using the whip as Trevor, so in my first playthrough I only unlocked Sypha and never used her much past the first 2 levels I had her on my team. But I did think it was cool how the level you travel to after her is just this haunted ship with the seesaws. It's kind of a big gauntlet with 2 bosses, but I thought the stage was a decent challenge to play through. I then decided to experiment with it a little more after writing and recording that line, and I can say, Sypha's default fire attack is what made me not like playing as her, but then the ice attack you unlock freezes enemies and kills them in one hit when they're in the ice block. That was very useful and made this shaking tower sequence super easy. So, your mileage may vary. The third character you unlock is one you bypass entirely if you went the Sypha route. That would be Dracula's son, Alucard. He's probably my favorite of the partner characters. His default attack with the energy balls doesn't do a lot of damage, but I mainly liked him because you can transform into a bat and make many platforming sections trivialized. That came quite in handy, especially in these caves with the tight spaces and the spikes. Especially handy because the game is every bit as challenging as I heard it was. In many instances, I was down for it, like those new obstacles I talked about earlier. Finding ways to jump through the seesaws over a pit was tense gameplay. I felt the same when finding my way up the clock tower and then having to readjust my strategies on the way down. I thought these were fun moments where the difficulty was high and demanded a lot from the player, but not to an unreasonable extent. But then, in other moments, I felt like the game was supremely over-designed, like a section where you have to time your way up the stairs while skeleton dudes shoot at you. That's one thing, but then did the enemies really need to be flying on the screen during that? Does that really add anything other than stress to an already tightly timed sequence? And then there are moments that are just pure frustration. Let's have a sequence where the ground starts shaking, forcing you to climb really fast. That's a great idea. But what doesn't work is when enemies that appear right as you get hit by them. And it's impossible to dodge unless you knew an enemy was going to be there. What an idiot I was for my inability to predict that. Maybe that wouldn't be so bad, but the damage output in Castlevania 3 is really high, so screw-ups like that are poised to send you rooms back, and it can become kind of annoying. This is where the Japanese original version comes into the picture. See, the whole time I've been talking about Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse for the NES, the US version of the game. However, it's well documented at this point that the original Famicom version of the game is much easier than the NES one. Why is that? Well, I'm glad you didn't ask, so I can answer. The reason was that back in the 80s and 90s, kids renting games from Blockbuster or Hollywood Video was a big part of the games market in the United States. However, this cut into the profit margins for the publishers of the game. To combat this, many Japanese game devs would simply make the US version of a game virtually impossible to beat in a single rental period. Players would then either need to buy the game at full price or rent it multiple times, so the US version was more difficult than the original. For example, enemies will do a lot less damage to you in the original Japanese version. In the original, there was a fixed amount of damage done to you by enemies, but in the US version, late game enemies will hurt you much more. And certain abilities were tweaked to make the game more challenging. In the original version, Grant throws a dagger across the screen at no cost to your ammo meter, but in the US version, he just stabs right in front of him. To be honest, I felt like both had their own uses though. I thought the stab attack made fighting enemies at odd angles like the Medusa heads easier since the hitbox is pretty generous. When aiming a straight shot at them was much tougher. But for the long-range bosses, a stab attack will be pretty useless. Alucard also consumes hearts in bat form much faster than he does in the original, so there are a lot of reasons why people consider the Japanese version to be the definitive edition of Castlevania 3. Not all of them are gameplay related though. The music is another one. The soundtrack that the composers cooked up for this game absolutely lives up to the varied stage designs. Castlevania 3's soundtrack is filled with instantly iconic bops, and that is true for either version, but the Famicom version is just able to use a special chip for increased quality of sound in its music. So the tracks sounded much better on that version compared to the NES edition. Take a listen to some comparisons. It sounds great in either version, but yeah, the Japanese soundtrack definitely clears the US one. If you want to play the Japanese version, you are in luck. The Castlevania Anniversary Collection, which comes with Castlevanias 1 through 4, Bloodlines, the Game Boy Duo, and Kid Dracula also came with the Japanese versions. Except for Castlevania 2, that's just the US one for some reason. But that's how I captured this footage of the Famicom version for the video. It is still a classic Castlevania, so it's no walk in the park, but it's definitely the easier game than the NES counterpart. But I honestly feel like I might return to the NES version more often in the future. That's because of a cheat code not present in the original. If you enter Help Me as your name at the start, your default life count goes from 3 to 10. See, I told you I was going to explain it later. Now that you know what you're up against, I'm sure you can see why 10 lives is pretty tempting. Even when you get a game over, your default life count is still 10. It makes it so that getting through tough sections is less stressful since you have a bunch more chances to get it right without redoing whole sections. This cheat code kind of tips the scales back towards the NES version for me, but the late game enemy damage certainly was nothing to scoff at. The end game was kind of wearing me out as I was getting closer to it, as my first playthrough of the game took me over 3 hours, especially with bosses like this two-headed dude in the water. The limited range of my attacks and the knockback into the water was starting to annoy me by the time I got this far into the game. But what then really energized me on the first go was around this part where you reach the castle and the music is this sick remix of the Vampire Killer theme from Castlevania 1. Like an, ah man, this is where the fun begins kind of moment. And so I was starting to get my groove again as I was tearing enemies apart with the holy water, and appreciating the level design again when you had to do cool stuff like jump on top of spike dropping platforms. Still though, the last level felt pretty overwhelming and was just kind of overdoing it. Like, how about you deal with flying heads that cause the game to start chugging like nobody's business during an auto-scrolling sequence? And then, crumbling floors and flying enemies and skeleton dudes all at once. Like, damn, did they think that was overkill? Also, in the final segment, do yourself a favor and grab this axe. Dracula is a 3-phase long fight in this game. The first phase can be tricky, as he summons fire in 2 spots around you and then a big one in the middle. This can be easy to avoid if you're far away from Dracula, as that will give you more time to run around. Less so if he's close. But it's easier to get a pattern going with this than the first game's final boss, I thought. The second phase is these heads that drop fire from their mouths. The holy water made kinda short work of them, but the axe is the better weapon to have, because the third phase is really kicking my ass until I let myself die and got the axe instead. I also grinded hearts from this spot here before Dracula, so I had a surplus of ammo. The final Dracula phase is easy if you hang back in the corner and toss the axe as the weak spot. Not a cakewalk like the final battle of Simon's Quest, but still much easier than fighting him directly. In the end, Trevor and the character you're currently teamed up with watch the castle crumble as the day is saved, ending Castlevania 3. That's when you get the second quest, which is even more difficult than the first, but you also start with the current partner character by your side, for what that's worth. But in conclusion, I don't really have a lot to say on Castlevania 3. I thought the game was really good. It wasn't my favorite at certain moments, but I thought the whole game was filled with creativity and fun moments and new ideas. Not every moment was a hit, and maybe my positive attitude has a lot to do with the 10 lives cheat code, but I had a good time with Dracula's Curse and could very easily see myself playing it again in the near future. Same for Castlevania 1 and 2. So far, even just looking at the NES games, I have really enjoyed the Castlevania series just like I thought I would. The NES trilogy is worthy of the legacy it has, and left a clear mark on the industry. They might not be for everyone playing in 2025, but they certainly were for me, and I enjoyed my time with them. Most importantly though, I'm glad that you guys in the audience really resonated with my videos in these games. I just decided to do the NES Castlevania trilogy on a pure whim. I wanted to try something new and make videos on them. Sure, they don't have a million views each, but I feel like it doesn't really matter anymore. Because even just 20,000 people watching and enjoying something I made where I, a Gen Z kid, gets to share the joy of something from the past and seeing people who did grow up with it enjoying me talking about it and sharing their memories with it, that's honestly enough for me. People resonating with it who are older, younger, or my same age is a cool thing to see. So needless to say, I had fun with this, and I think I'm going to keep talking about older games and videos formatted like these ones. And also keep talking about Castlevania, because I'm now really excited to play Super Castlevania 4, and Bloodlines, and Rondo of Blood, and Symphony of the Night. That will probably be pretty soon, so I thank everyone who enjoyed these videos so far. But that's about all the time we have for today, so I'll close by saying what I always do. If you made it this far into the video, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.